Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren. I am the chief economist at American Compass. And this week we have a very timely discussion for you with Robert Bryce, author of the Robert Bryce Substack and an expert on all things energy related. We are talking critical minerals, rare earths, magnets, and a set of technologies that no one knew anything about until a few months ago when it became absolutely central, it turns out, to our negotiations with China. Robert is someone I've known, I guess, going back to when I started at the Manhattan Institute about a decade ago. He's a fantastic scholar who I think brings a sort of very dispassionate and tech-focused lens to understanding a lot of policy issues where at the end of the day, the actual nature of the raw materials, the technical challenges with extracting them, refining them, which materials are better for what are really what drive the outcomes and what policymakers need to understand. And so he has been doing a lot of work on understanding exactly what he calls the strategic elements are that are most important to our economy that we have lost all control of to China, how that is rippling back through into our dependence for a lot of advanced technologies, and therefore ultimately why we have found in our negotiations with China that the tariff type issues, the general what do we import from China has faded into the background, and can we get this one very specific kind of magnet that turns out to be at the core of the modern economy is what everybody is talking about. So I think he does a fantastic job explaining exactly what's going on the technical side, what's going on the policy side, and then frankly taught me a lot about what it's actually going to take to fix this, because I think we have a mindset where we'd like to believe, well, look, when we really get to a war footing, when we really focus on something, we can just fix it. And that doesn't seem to be the case here, given the kinds of not just capacity, but also expertise, workforce, equipment that we simply don't have anymore because we thought for so long it didn't matter. So I think you'll find that really interesting and helpful to making sense of what's going on. Before we get to it, got to promote a couple of, I think, especially good things we had at Commonplace this week. We've got John Carney talking about Zoran Mamdani's Park Slope Populist Coalition. Who are these supporters? Are they actually upper income? Are they actually struggling economically? How do we make sense of what that means? Aaron Wren on what's going on in Detroit and the great turnaround there economically, and a really nice introspective piece from Nick Rowan on what he calls helicopter parenting, which it turns out includes taking your child in a helicopter. So be sure to read those. Check out Understanding America, of course. We will be off for July 4th, but back again next Monday. And here is Robert Bryce. And we are joined by the inimitable Robert Bryce. How are you, sir?
Hi, good morning, good afternoon. I'm fine, thank you. Glad to see you. Glad to be on with you.
It is wonderful to see you. You are my original think tank companion. The first thing I ever did when I got to the Manhattan Institute was an event with you, and you've been giving me useful knowledge ever since. So really excited for this conversation.
What was that? What was that event? Was that in Washington?
Yeah, it was a briefing they put together on energy policy, and so
that was a long time ago.
I remember we were just riding the cab. You were telling me how to be a think tank fellow, and so far the advice was all very good. But
I failed badly, but got fired. But that's okay. I'm glad to be fired and glad to be on my own.
Well, the Substack you are writing, robertbryce.substack.com, I think is indispensable on energy issues as always, but especially recently on critical minerals and rare earth stuff, which I think.
Sure.
People focused on industrial policy, focused on competition with China, have been talking about for going on a decade now. The Chinese, of course, have been working on it for several decades, but it is really in the last couple months, I think, with the escalating trade war and the extraordinary extent to which this has emerged as such an important point of leverage that I think everyone is suddenly saying, oh my gosh, what is the difference between a critical mineral and a rare earth and a magnet for starters, and how on earth have we gotten here? So let's start with the basics. There are all these terms flying around. Organize them for us, and which ones should we be focused on?
Sure. Well, I think it's important first, Oren, to put some historical context to this. And, there's the periodic table of elements, and there are 100 and some odd. Well, by my calculation, in fact, using the International Energy Agency's own numbers, China now has effective, not necessarily monopoly control. They have monopoly control over many of the strategic elements, but dominant positions in 33 strategic elements. Critical minerals is not exactly the right term, but I call them strategic elements. But nevertheless, this has been a strategy for the Chinese government now for more than 3 decades. In 1992, Deng Xiaoping, who was really the most powerful, I would argue, since the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao, and then now, of course, Xi Jinping. But Deng Xiaoping said in 1992 during this famous Southern tour, and he went to a rare earth facility, and he said, I'm quoting almost exactly, the Middle East has oil, we have rare earths, we're going to exploit them. And so for the last 3 decades, China has had a very concerted, focused, long-term view on exploiting the rare earth elements. They're also known as the lanthanides, or the green elements, neodymium, praseodymium, terbium, dysprosium, lanthanum, yttrium, scandium. These are critical ingredients, particularly in magnets, but they're found in everything from wiper blade motors or car wiper motors to transmissions. These are incredibly important elements that the U.S. and the West has largely taken for granted and assumed that in a market economy we can always have access to them. Well, that's not true. And now China, in response to Trump's tariffs, is clearly flexing its muscles. And all of the global automakers are now in convulsions because they don't have access to sufficient supplies of rare earths. So this is before we started, the West has sleepwalked into this problem, and we're waking up to it, but it's going to be a very long process to extricate or try and address this strategic element supply.
Yeah. Now, one of the things I think is important about the term rare earths, of course, is that it's not that they are rare exactly. And my sense is that a key distinction from the, OPEC oil example is that, at least until the U.S. developed fracking, there was a sense in which if you wanted oil, you had to go to OPEC.
Right.
To the extent that China has sort of cornered this market, is it because of a sort of natural endowment of the actual stuff, or is it just that they're the ones who have chosen to develop and process it?
I think that's a really good point, Oren. I think the latter is the more salient point. Yes, rare earths are not necessarily rare, but the places that are willing to take the environmental hit to process them and refine them are rare. And China has essentially said, we will do this and we'll take the environmental hit. And now they control, different estimates, but according to the U.S. Department of Energy, they control 90% of the global market for neodymium iron boron magnets. And that's a technology, in fact, that was discovered by General Motors. But now those magnets are in critical shortage all over the world. And it's not just that they control 90% of the magnet supply. They effectively control 100% of the global market for dysprosium and terbium, which are needed to dope those magnets so they can work at high temperature. But again, now, there was just an article today in the Wall Street Journal about Ford saying they're day-to-day, Ford Motor Company is now day-to-day whether they're going to have to shut down some of their assembly lines because they don't have enough magnets.
So let's dig in a little bit on I think the technical side of this is actually really important because it's, people sort of hear like magnet, right? Like I still picture the thing hanging from a string that you use for your, science experiment in 7th grade.
Yeah.
When we're talking about these rare earths, I guess maybe it's most useful kind of to step through the supply chain. So if we start at where you're literally shoveling up the dirt, and the dirt has, or sometimes it's the refuse from other processes.
Yeah.
There's essentially trace amounts of this stuff, which is,
right.
That's the sense in which it's rare. And so it has to be, first of all, you have to be willing to shovel it out of the ground. And then you have to be willing to do the very intensive industrial processes, essentially to extract it, purify it, refine it.
Yeah.
What does that look like in practice? When we say this is like an environmental issue, that there are a lot of places that people want it, my sense is that this isn't like, oh, NEPA review, people don't want to live near a highway. It's like, this is pretty difficult, dirty stuff, right? What does it actually look like to be processing rare earths?
Sure. Well, and this is the key. And just to, preface that, the technical part of this. So the U.S. is now producing rare earth ore at the Molycorp mine in California at Mountain Pass. And that project, I think it was owned by Chevron. Then it went public with one company. They went bust because the Chinese then flooded the market. And now I think it's MP Materials is the name of the company. I think they're also publicly traded. So they're digging rare earth ore out of the ground and concentrating it, but then they have to ship it to China for refining. So, and that to get to the specifics on the refining part of this is where the process is difficult, because I was in Australia last week and the week before, and I met with some mining guys, and they said, yeah, one of the problems with the rare earth refining process is that you end up with a lot of radioactive material on the back end. And, of course, the public and regulators freak out when anyone says the words radioactive. But this mining guy was saying, therein lies one of the biggest issues. So you've got now some refining of rare earths happening in Malaysia, I believe it is, with it's not Arafura Resources, I think it's Linus. The Australians are increasing their rare earth ore production. I was in Missouri yesterday, and there was a guy from the Missouri Department of Natural Resources saying Missouri has lots of rare earths as well. So it's not getting the supply out of I'm not going to say it's trivial, but digging up the ore is relatively easy. Converting that ore into the refined element itself, dysprosium or terbium or neodymium, that's a trick. And then there's the fabrication of the magnets as well. And what we've seen is that China is now effectively dominating every part of that supply chain and has vertically integrated all of it. And the rest of the world is, again, looking around saying, damn, we're screwed here. And I don't want to get too technical, but I think screwed is the right term.
And how much of the screwedness, to use the even more technical term,
yeah,
is sort of at the basic technological capability versus the industrial scale? Because my sense is, I mean, we pioneered most of this stuff, right? Like, it's not like we don't know how to do it. Has China pushed the frontier on the actual technology forward, or they're just willing to dedicate the space to it, sink the capital into it, build the scale for it?
Well, I think it's yes. I think it's all of those, but I think it's particular. You've seen where different companies have tried to get into the market and get into the rare earth space. Well, then China will look at that and say, oh, you want to compete with us? Well, how about if we just drop the price by half or by, 90%? So this is the other issue that, and I know you've been vocal on the tariffs and the rest of it, but I think this is what, is going to be particularly hard for the U.S. and the rest of the rest of the Western countries to respond to, is that to counter China's dominance of these strategic elements, it's going to require sustained government backing and potentially enormous losses to have government-sponsored entities that are going to be able to effectively compete with China on the supply side. And whether it's on the ore, it's on the refining, and on the fabrication. And, in the U.S., we've been, I say sleepwalked. I think that's the right term for this, because there's been this bias that, the market is going to solve everything. Well, it does until it doesn't. And so we're seeing that on the strategic elements. And I think it's one of the big challenges we face on nuclear energy as well, is that it's going to require long-term sustained backing from government from both sides of the aisle. That is bipartisan, decadal support with real money and regulatory and policy support that will allow the U.S. to counter China's dominance. And that's a very difficult political challenge.
Yeah, I definitely want to get into the question of, okay, like what do we do about it?
Yeah.
But the final phase I'm curious about, just on the technical side, is sort of coming out of fabrication. Okay, we now have, let's say, we have the purified elements, refined elements. We have the ability to actually, I'm going to use, I'm sure, the wrong terms, but mold them into magnets, dope them with the other elements that they need. It seems like, I think for a while, everyone sort of just vaguely talked about critical minerals, rare earth elements. Maybe we're worried about lithium for batteries. Maybe we're worried about this and that, what goes into a radar system. At the end of the day, the very tip of the spear seems to be these particular types of magnets, particularly that are used in motors, essentially.
Right.
In very,
Yeah.
and people think, a motor, I don't mean internal combustion engine. In fact, to the contrary, I mean electrical motors and all
Right.
of the places in life that we essentially convert electricity into force,
Yeah.
torque, and then force.
Yeah. Right.
Is that right? Is that sort of of all the places there are problems, is that the one that is most acute, at least at this point?
Well, I would say we have to broaden this out, Oren. It's beyond just the lanthanides and their role in magnets and motors. We've also got the elements like gallium and germanium that are needed for semiconductor manufacturing. Antimony, which is a critical element in lead acid batteries. And the other part of this that I think is critical is that the International Energy Agency, which, as you know, is a very political entity, they did a report, and I wrote about this recently in my piece called Anti-Magnetic on Substack, that they said, in fact, when it comes to the magnets and the supply chain for magnets, they are projecting that China's dominance in that marketplace will increase over the next 15 years. So I think it's important that we recognize the issue around magnets, but it's also about tungsten, it's antimony, it's other elements that go beyond the magnet issue and to a broad variety of elements that are absolutely essential for industrial production and in particular for defense. So, I take no pleasure in pointing all of this out, but I'm a reporter. I have to be sober about this, and there have been very few. I think. Well, there's been some good reporting on this, but the U.S. is waking up to this very late, I think, and China is looking at this and I saw one headline where the Trump administration, some of the officials said they demanded the Chinese resume rare earth supplies, shipments. And the Chinese response was kind of like, yeah, demand? You're going to demand. Well, okay, yeah, we love it when you demand, right? Because we have very few strategic cards to play when it comes to saying, well, if you don't, then we're going to get mad, and that doesn't play.
Well, that's where all of this has sort of now come to the forefront, is in the context of this specific, whether you want to call it a trade war crossed with a negotiation. Essentially, what was so interesting, certainly from my perspective as someone who does a lot on trade policy, is you saw this escalation on tariffs, and where the U.S. clearly seemed to have some leverage was on the actual tariff side. China really wants to be exporting a lot into the U.S., where China had leverage was not in a reciprocal sense on the tariff side, right? China's leverage was not saying, oh, yeah, well, then you can't sell stuff to us.
Right.
China's leverage was in saying, oh, yeah, then we won't send you these magnets,
right.
Essentially, at least at the top of the list. The U.S. then, I think when you look at, particularly after the negotiations in London, there were some things China also really wanted from the U.S. in terms of aerospace parts and so forth. But to your point, if you kind of use the, game theory rhetoric of escalation dominance and so forth, it does seem like this was the thing at the end of the back and forth, that at the end of the day, the thing that China had most leverage on, that was most painful to the United States, was this particular class of stuff. Is that, do you think that's fair?
Oh, I think that's right on target. And the historical context, I think, is really important here as well, Oren. And this is, going back to my piece on Substack, because, I'm not a particularly smart guy. I'm just, but I'm fairly observant.
You do okay for yourself.
I do okay. I'm not bragging, not complaining. But I pointed this out in my book in 2010, Power Hungry: The Myths of Green Energy and the Real Fuels of the Future. I said, if there's a tariff, some kind of tariff war, trade war, China can respond effectively with these embargoes on rare earths. And that's exactly what's happened. But China has warned about this in 2019, and I pointed out this out on my Substack. And this was in it was in May or April of 2019. Trump issued some kind of tariff against China, and on May 20th, 3 days after the Trump administration implemented these tariffs, Xi Jinping made an appearance at a rare earth magnet facility in China. And then later that month, it was on May 31st of 2019, People's Daily Online, which is a mouthpiece for the Chinese government. This writer, Wu Yuhei, said American politicians are saying they're going to exert extreme pressure against China. And he says, there is no winner in the trade war. We advise the U.S. side not to underestimate the Chinese side's ability to safeguard its development rights and interests. Don't say we didn't warn you! Exclamation point. And the exclamation point was in the original. And so I included that in the piece that I wrote. So, I think this is, we can talk about trade policy, we can talk about tariffs, and I think those are all key, and it's something you've focused on a lot. To me, this is partly a result of this short-term thinking that dominates in the United States compared to China, where Deng Xiaoping took a decadal view, and the Chinese have taken a decadal view on their role with industrial supplies, industrial policy, and we're focused on the next quarter, or the next biennium, or the next quadrennium, right?
Yeah, and that brings us perfectly to the question of what is to be done, as they say. Yeah. One thing that's so striking to me, to your point, is that 2010 was very far ahead of the curve to be focusing on this stuff. 2017, 2018, you started to see, folks like Senator Rubio starting to kind of ask about it as he did work on Chinese industrial policy. Yeah. At the point where we actually were starting to engage in more of a trade conflict, the Chinese were literally saying, this is what we are going to do.
Right.
6 years after that, we appear to still be at the 1 yard line, whatever the metaphor for, not really even out of the starting gate yet. There have been various bills in Congress that never really go anywhere.
Yeah.
Particularly striking to me is that now, months into this current conflict, there is still no actual action. And perhaps I'm oversimplifying things to say, look, if you realize this was a national security imperative and you used the Defense Production Act and you said cost is no object, there's no reason you couldn't be just on a crash course of building this stuff, have a plan to have a full supply online in insert appropriate time frame.
Sure.
First of all, is that plausible? Why or why not? And what would it take? What is steps 1 and 2 if we're actually getting serious about this?
It's good, and I'm glad you're prompting me on this, because I probably need to write a follow up. In many of the articles that I have in my head but not published. But yeah, I think that is plausible to say we're going to have a strategic plan, and we're going to have we're going to ramp up these supplies and refining and production within 24 months. There is a facility here in Texas, I think it's in Fort Worth, where they're producing magnets, but they are called, the term of art is sintered, sintered, sintered magnets. But remember, these, the form factor for these magnets varies, right? Whether it's going in an electric vehicle, whether it's going in a wind turbine or a cell phone or a loudspeaker or a wiper blade or wiper motor or something. All of these have form factors that different manufacturers need, different sizes, different shapes, different, all these things differ. So in just spitballing here and thinking out loud about that question, I think it's similar in some ways to how the West needs to respond on the nuclear energy front. The U.S. is not producing effectively any enriched uranium for the nuclear power sector, and we're going to have to ramp that up with new, facilities to refine uranium for nuclear power. I think it's going to require something similar with the rare earths, but I can see it occurring or being forging an alliance of Western countries, particularly the resource-rich mining giants like Canada, Australia, the U.S., and saying we have to counter China, and we have to counter them on all of these elements, including uranium, all of the lanthanides, yttrium, antimony, tungsten. We have to be ready to counter China on all of these. And so it would be some kind of NATO for strategic elements, I think. I'm, again, just spitballing here, but I think it's going to take something of that scale where you have an alliance of countries that are realizing the danger that they're in on the industrial supply side and saying, we don't have a choice. We can't just rely on the market. We have to be much more is it mercantilist? What is the right term for that? We have to be much more focused on assuring we can supply these things ourselves regardless of the price.
And to what extent would you be optimistic that markets can sort of play a leading role if if shaped. And so what I mean is, one interesting proposal is we essentially need price supports, right?
Yeah.
We want this to be done with private investment, but the US, could essentially backstop. We will buy as much as you produce at X value. And if China tanks the market, fine, we'll put in a strategic reserve. But with that kind of price confidence, markets could actually work versus to what extent could you do all that you want and private capital is still going to say that this is not on our top 10 list of places we might actually look for a return. The US is literally going to have to come in and, at the extreme, build the things.
Yeah. Well, I think that's one idea that has been floated for uranium, and for that you set a floor price that the U.S. government guarantees, and that could be, it's no perfect market fix, right? But it's a way to kind of have a market incentive where you say, look, if you produce X tons of magnets, X tons of ore, X tons of finished, high assay, low enriched uranium, we will guarantee a certain price, and that above your production cost. And so I think that's one way to do it. But I think the first step is going to have to be, where are we going to mine it? Who's going to do the refining? And then who's going to do the finished magnets, finished other goods? But again, remember the lanthanides, I think there's 17 of them. There are another, 16 other strategic elements that we have to think about as well. And antimony is one of them. And the price, I have a friend of mine who works in the lead acid battery business. He said their costs have gone up for antimony. They're still able to get it, but their costs are up 3 or 4x. And so we can mine it here. There are antimony mines in the United States, but we have to ramp that up. So I think it's the other part of this, again, now just kind of thinking about it out loud, is we're going to have some change in the regulatory regime to assure that these mines can get online and get producing and do so relatively quickly. And that is going to be a very difficult challenge because of all the NGOs that are, opposed to any kind of production of anything that comes out of the ground.
Last question on this, then we got to talk nuclear power also.
Sure.
What is your short-term forecast, for lack of a better word, insofar as we don't have, even if we did have a crash program, it's 12, 24 months. You mentioned major automakers are already struggling. How does this play out? Do you think that the Chinese sort of want to make it as painful as possible, but keep the supply there? Do you really worry about a cutoff, and how would companies react? What do you see as the sort of different, base case, good case, bad case that we could be headed toward?
Sure. Well, I think you're right on that one point that the Chinese are going to, this is China saying, oh, you want to mess around on a trade war? Let's slow walk some of these export permits. And this was one of the things, in fact, a Ford Motor official said in the Wall Street Journal today, that they have not seen any acceleration in the processing of these permits. Now, what China did in April after the tariffs were announced, I think it's the Ministry of Commerce, if I'm not mistaken, that as they said, well, if you want these magnets now, you have to apply to them. And then but there's been no increase in the speed at which that Chinese agency is processing these permits. So I think if I was going to just describe how China has reacted to this, their reaction would go something like this. Oh, President Trump, right, you want to put tariffs on us. Okay, fine. We're going to limit the supply of rare earth elements to everyone all over the world, including the European automakers, the Indian automakers. This has been a big issue. The headlines, I've been tracking the headlines and the stories on this now for several weeks. They are, one of the headlines from India, magnet mayhem. Number of Indian companies awaiting licenses from China for rare earths doubles. Industry supplies hit hard. Another, China's rare earth curbs hit Indian auto sector. So this, if I was going to, how would I describe this from a just political science standpoint? The Chinese, our response to Trump is, oh, you want to mess with us? We're going to remind the rest of the world that you're not their friend. And we're going to do that by limiting these rare earth exports. And so, that's how I see the geopolitical game here, is that China is using the tariffs to, I think the right word would put a wedge between a lot of these other countries and companies between them and saying, well, you want to be with the U.S., that's fine, but we're the ones that you have to have when it comes to these strategic elements.
And have other countries reacted? What is does that, well, let me put it this way. Do other countries react primarily thus far by saying, oh, wow, we really do need to all get our act together and develop an alternative? Or do they react by saying, let's all be nicer to China so we can continue using their stuff?
Well, right. Well, in the near term, that's what they have to say, is the latter. And what you've seen is a lot of these manufacturers, the automakers, realizing that if they want the rare earth elements, they want or the magnets or the finished goods, they're having to ship some of their components to China and have them finished there. So again, another way that China is using this trade policy and industrial policy to squeeze the West. And, and they've done this very effectively. And, it's just been fascinating to me as somebody who's watched this for a long time to see how this has unfolded. And now suddenly China, over the last now 3 months, has roughly just said, okay, well, you want to play hardball? Well, yeah, we'll play hardball. We can play hardball too. As the editorial in the People's Daily said in 2019, China can respond to this. And they're playing the long game. And unfortunately, we've been plagued by this short-termism.
Well, to the many, many policymakers listening to this very conversation, please do something.
Yeah, and get busy. And I think that there is some there is a lot of concern in the DOD in the U.S. The European automakers are all, very concerned when you read the press about what they're saying. But, and you asked before, how long will this take to come up with an effective response? It's going to be years. It's going to be measured in, 2 years to get, some ore moving, another couple of years to get the refining, another, but potentially another decade or more where we have no choice but to rely on China for a lot of these strategic elements. And, if war breaks out and we need antimony, bismuth, tungsten, some of these, elements for defense production, it could get really difficult.
Yeah. Well, that's where maybe I disagree a little bit. I think certainly in the model we have been operating under, it would take that long. In the model that the U.S. seems to me has shown it can rise to in an actual national security crisis, it seems if you literally said, we have $100 billion to spend on this, we are assigning all of the top laboratories, we are, commandeering whatever engineering resources we need. We have, via eminent domain, decided where these things are going to be built. We have waived all of the NEPA and other environmental reviews. We expect stuff to be coming off the line in 9 months. There are obviously at some point physical constraints and logistical constraints, but whether you're thinking about what it looks like to actually mobilize for war, or this is obviously a politically less in fashion example in some places. If you look at what the U.S. did with Operation Warp Speed to say, we need to go from zero to mass production of an mRNA vaccine in 6 or 9 months, it does seem to me that's at least the thought experiment worth going through. Because if the alternative is the 8 to 10 year sort of timeline, I do think policymakers need to sort of be put on the spot and asked, are you saying that's acceptable or not? And if not, what are you going to do about it?
Well, it's interesting and happy to, I won't necessarily say disagree, but,
please disagree.
Well, okay. So I think you're wrong.
Yeah.
Warp speed involves, something in a lab where you're just, a few centrifuges and you can clone this, clone that, and you can do it on the lab bench. For some of these like manganese, molybdenum, the mining and of these materials, we're talking about megatons of ore. We're talking about the mass involved, that just the physical nature of this challenge is requiring big iron, big steel, big trucks that you have to mobilize. And this is in a mining sector where permitting new mines has gone from an average of, what was it? S&P Global did a report on this just recently, 8 or 9 years to now 18 or 20 years. Now, agreed, the U.S. could mobilize and say, well, this is warlike footing. We need to do this. And we could, maybe 24 months is too long, and maybe it's 12 months, but I think over a sustained period to be a real counter to China, it's going to take a multi-country, multidisciplinary focus and multi-industrial focus on saying, what are the strategic elements that they are have total control over that are the most critical? Start there, then work your way backward, whether it's gallium, germanium, molybdenum, manganese, antimony, bismuth, and then go to the rare earth. So that's going to be difficult, because, Trump, there's some things that Trump has done very well, but he's also has alienated a lot of people that have been our traditional allies. And now, how do you get them back on side to say, okay, we can disagree on these tariffs, but we got to get on side on this issue. So I'm very hopeful. I'm bullish the U.S., but I'm also very sober about how this plays out. And I think that's partly my sobriety comes from watching the nuclear sector and the slow development of new nuclear in the U.S.
Well, it's actually a really interesting point that in the case studies where you could say U.S. really did turn it on and go quickly, it was in places where we were already the world leader, and it was a question of what we pointed it at, right? Whether you're talking about in 1940 turning, the factories to make a different chunk of metal, or in Operation Warp Speed, taking our world-beating, cutting-edge biotech sector and directing at this, we had the human capital, we had the institutions, and now we are in an area where we have totally abandoned the basic infrastructure, the expertise, the talent, the know-how, and that stuff you can't just buy, even if you have all the money in the world.
And abandon the mining. And so, we have I was in Australia and talking to, guys who are experts in mining. And when I was in Perth, separate from the meeting I had and when talking about rare earths, and they just said, these copper mines, this is the other area where you look at nickel and copper, two base metals that are now strategic minerals when you talk about the green elements and the rest of it. That's another area where China has a strategic advantage and a dominant position in the marketplace. So again, I'm very optimistic about the U.S. because of we have the incredible intellectual capital, but we also are facing debt problems where the government doesn't have a lot of money to throw at all of this. So I just fear it's going to take years to work through this, and China has some very powerful cards it can play to counter whatever the U.S. does on cobalt, copper, nickel, all the other elements that we've been talking about.
Well, we have to leave our listeners on a more optimistic note. So let's talk nuclear for a minute. Although maybe we'll be just as pessimistic there. I don't know.
No, I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic but sober about nuclear, and the U.S. is making a lot of strides. And I'll jump to the point here. I think the executive orders that President Trump signed a few weeks ago, the 4 executive orders on nuclear energy, are the most important endorsements of nuclear power by a sitting American president since Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace speech in 1953. And they can be the basis of more catalyze more investment into nuclear in the U.S. But that's going to have to accelerate as well. And it's going to have to accelerate on a lot of different fronts, on the regulatory front, capital front, fuel front, waste front. But I'm hopeful for nuclear in the U.S. I think it's going to take some time, but there are a bunch of companies that are very capable of new designs, but now we have to build them. We have to shut up and quit talking about it and actually build the damn things.
Yeah. Well, elaborate on that point about the EOs for a moment, because that's really interesting. And I think, people have gotten the habit of thinking of a lot of EOs from any administration as just sort of symbolic, rhetorical statements of purpose.
Yeah.
The good ones actually do something. And what, if anything, would you say you would highlight as, here are the couple of things that they're actually flipping the switch on, they're changing conditions that could help make a difference?
Yeah. Well, first, this wasn't an executive order, but Trump reached out and fired, was it David Wright? I think it was the NRC commissioner the other day. Now, whether he has the authority to do that or not, because the NRC is an independent agency, we'll see. But, the litigation, there's litigation on a lot of fronts. You're a lawyer, this will be litigated forever. But Trump sees the necessity of reforming the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to make the permitting happen more quickly. The other part that I think was interesting about of all the EOs that were issued was the one directing the Department of Defense to take a look at this and having DOD potentially deploy reactors first. And that would be something that they could do relatively quickly compared to the private sector. And this makes a lot of sense for the Department of Defense because they have a lot of bases that are far-flung and they don't need to go through the NRC. They can manage it themselves. They're expert already at building and managing nuclear reactors, nuclear fuel, nuclear waste. The Navy's done this for, 70 years? So that could, be an interesting area where, we talked about government intervention in markets and catalyzing new investment and new commercialization of projects. This could be the DOD could be the one that leads here and because they're developing a micro reactor called Project Pele, that could really be very significant. So that executive order among the four, I think, and, some of this I'm just thinking about now as we're talking about it, could be very effective.
Long-term for nuclear, what do you think is the most sort of positive bullish case? Is it that if we really invest in this and get it right, it could be the market-leading technology? Or is it, look, this is always going to be expensive and need a heavy role for government, but it has so many other benefits, industrial, environmental, whatever, that it's just a place we need to be investing?
Well, I think that point is absolutely correct. And, I've been saying the same thing for 15 years, end-to-end natural gas to nuclear. This is the way forward. And it's the way forward regardless of what you think about climate change. I'm bullish on nuclear in part because I hate the wind business. I hate wind energy. I hate those people with a burning passion. And the proliferation of wind turbines is bad for birds, bad for bats, bad for, rural Americans, rural people all over the world. That's one reason why nuclear is so important, because it requires 2,000 times less land than wind. But you can love nuclear regardless of what you think about climate change because of that small footprint. The power density is so key. And that's important. But it's also about the U.S. maintaining and developing technological leadership around the world. We want to be in that role. We don't want to cede it to the French, the South Koreans, and particularly the Russians. So now the race is on to winnow down all of these companies that are now trying to build small modular reactors. There are 51 of them. And we don't need 51 companies. We need 2 or 3 or 4. France built out their nuclear fleet in the 70s and 80s and 90s by concentrating on one design for a light water reactor that was designed by Framatome. And they built 3 gigawatts a year. That's the kind of model we need to emulate, but we need to get cracking.
Well, Robert Bryce, this has been fantastic. I'm working on a piece right now about how, ultimately the economic issues and the national security issues are so inseparable. And you have given me enough examples here to fill the entire thing. I think it's fascinating to see how much, at the end of the day, whether we want to or not, a lot of these market-related issues are becoming defense and security issues.
Yeah.
And I guess the upside is maybe we have better vocabulary for how to tackle those. But thank you very much.
And if I'll just add one quick thing, and I think that, maybe this was inevitable. I wrote a piece the other day about the strike on the nuclear plants in Iran. I think there was some inevitability about that, right? That was going to happen sooner or later. And if this kind of crisis, and I think it could turn into a crisis if the Chinese keep slow walking these export permits for rare earths. If this takes a crisis to make change happen, well, then it takes crisis and we got to recognize it and move on. But I agree with you. I think it's important to connect that economic, industrial, and defense issues here because they are very clear. And I'm hopeful. I'm sober but hopeful that the U.S. can address this.
All right, Robert Bryce. Read him at robertbryce.substack.com. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
And we will be back again soon with another episode of the American Compass Podcast.